You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/intotheportal. Of all the various shapes and forms, sights and sounds of paranormal phenomena, none are quite so disturbing and difficult to explain as the strange happenings of poltergeists. Beginning as frightening occurrences for our ancestors of a distant past, associated with ideas of various different realms of the dead, poltergeists as we know them today have of course evolved, with countless cases across the globe of these bizarre events occurring, terrorizing those around. Join us tonight on Into the Portal as we explore some obscure corners of Canadian poltergeist and haunting lore, and attempt to unravel the truly unexplainable and downright terrifying. Poltergeists.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay.
And we're back with another episode. Yay!
Honestly, I don't really see how we could have any other reaction than that, because we kind of like looked at our feed and we're like, wait a second, like the last regular episode was The Legend of Ned Kelly, and this month has just been so crazy busy. It kind of slipped away from us with all the Straight Up Strange stuff and like helping with Spellcast do the promo for SpellCon, which was today, which was sweet.
And Thanksgiving
kind of took away from a lot of things. Anyway, we're back.
Canadian Thanksgiving, which is different. It was funny. I had a lot of Americans coming through the shop, you know, doing tastings and whatever, and they were very curious, a lot of them, like, because they came during the holiday, and they didn't realize. A lot of them were confused. They're like, hey, wait, is it the Monday that's the holiday? Is it the entire weekends of the holiday? Or is it Friday to Monday? What's going on here? I don't get it. And I honestly didn't even really have an answer, because I immediately thought of Easter, and I was like, oh no, well, it's Good Friday. Wait, no, it's not Good Friday. But it feels kind of like it.
People just pick their different days on the weekend as their day.
True.
Their Thanksgiving day.
Like for us, we had Thanksgiving dinner on Saturday.
Indeed.
And then a lot of people traditionally have it on Sunday.
Yeah.
And then Monday, you got the day off.
Right.
That's the official holiday. And you can just like pig out on leftovers, which is great.
We did have a really great Thanksgiving. We had a really special kind of Thanksgiving surprise when we got a sweet shout out from Scott and Forrest from Astonishing Legends on Twitter, which was really sweet. So obviously shout out to those guys. We love their show. It's what got us going in podcasting, which was really cool.
Oh, I've been loving their latest episodes. I was just trying to tune into their latest at work, actually. I turned it on, the sound system, and then a couple came in and they were like, they had a couple of flights and they were listening in. So I don't know what they thought, but
Astonishing Legends mixes well with cider, does well with cider.
I think so. I think so.
We have a tiny bit of housekeeping before we get into this week's very haunted episode for you guys. So yeah, a couple things.
We do. We have a lot of new reviews. Yay. It's amazing. We love you all for it. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
We've been checking into the Canadian. There's tons on there.
Yeah, like
at least 7 or 8 or something, and they're all 5-star, and they're all just wicked, and I just love it.
Yeah,
I would love to read them out individually, but we don't really have time tonight. But go look at them. It's so great.
Yeah, check it out, and if you haven't, leave us a review, and wherever you listen, do pound that subscribe button and subscribe.
Because to be honest, it's one of those things. I look at them and I'm like, yay! Yeah. I love it. And when I'm having a moment, I'll just be like, no, this is why we do this, definitely. Which is awesome. So thank you. We really do appreciate it. And if you haven't already, please drop us a 5-star.
Yes.
And possibly a review if you have the time.
Indeed.
We love reading them.
Definitely.
We do. We have a couple new patrons too.
Yes, we do.
And thank you. We've got 2 new paranormal scholars.
Yes.
Big shout out to Big Tim, and JW Castor. And yeah, they've joined our $5 tier. The League of the Paranormal Scholars, I'm calling it.
It's a good little team of
It's good value.
scholars now.
You get a lot of cool stuff.
You do.
A shout out, obviously. You get some free goodies from the show, and you also get you get bonus content too, which yay. We just put up the Yowie on there not too long ago, and we have a couple coming down the pipe. Oh, the Grinning Man.
The Grinning Man.
Which was suggested by our producer, Jordan Yu. So thank you very much for that.
Awesome.
And then I think we have Cryptid too for the minisode.
We do. We are going to take a look at the legendary monster of Lake Champlain, Champ. As it were. One of our favorite Twitter accounts. Yeah, exactly. One of our favorite Twitter accounts. If you don't follow the Hotter Nessie on Twitter, go check it out for sure. One last little thing before we jump right into it here. We have our pumpkin carving contest, you guys. You know what? We haven't ourselves actually had a chance to carve a pumpkin yet. We are going to do a whole bunch. I mean, it's only the 19th today, something like that. Anyways.
It's the 10 days of Halloween. Yes. Let's carve a pumpkin every day.
Carve a pumpkin. Tag us at Strange Pods. That is our network account on Instagram. If you don't have Instagram, at Strange Podcasts on Twitter or Facebook as well. Just carve your pumpkin, follow us on one of those things, tag us in your post of your jack-o'-lantern.
At this point, if you're just not a social media person, if you just email us a picture,
we'll enter you. 100%.
We will.
Totally.
Because that's amazing. As long as you give us a mailing address so we can mail you some stuff, that would be great.
So bookmarks, stickers, magnets, epic vintage comics, candy. It is a pretty badass Halloween prize pack, you guys. So carve some. I can't wait to see. We did this last year with Into the Portal and we had some really sweet pumpkins. And so I can't wait to see what you guys have.
Me too.
All right, you ready to jump into this?
Well, let's do it.
Poltergeists of Canada.
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Getting into it. We've kind of had this ongoing poltergeist theme on this month because obviously it's Halloween Horror Fest and all this stuff. And we covered Poltergeist on our Film Friday, the original, and Beetlejuice too. And now we're just going to get into some poltergeists of good old creepy Canada.
Oh, yeah. So let's get the definition of a poltergeist here before we jump right into things.
Okay. So loosely defined, a poltergeist would be a ghost or other supernatural being who is supposedly responsible for physical disturbances. This could include loud noises, objects thrown around, and or disappearing and appearing at random. These objects could be household objects. They could be objects that just shouldn't be there.
Right.
All sorts of creepy stuff. Also physical contact. It could be biting, scratching, pulling hair. Other phenomena also commonly reported, just weird stuff, man.
Very strange stuff.
Yeah, telekinetic type stuff. You know what I mean? Like cutlery being bent in half, and also covered drawer, anything, right? Just ominous, unnatural stuff.
And it comes with very much so. You did it yes, definitely. And it's the physical contact aspect of it that's the most just downright bone chilling for me. The idea of biting, scratching, pulling hair with an entity from the other side, whether this is the spirit of a deceased human, just a straight up non-human entity. That we're going to get into all this stuff here in tonight's episode. But before we get into some of these, we have a couple of really cool Canadian poltergeist stories that are lesser known. We feel like you guys will probably have never heard of these, except maybe Ace over in Nothing Ever Happens in Canada. Maybe she's heard of these because she's pretty adept.
They're obscure.
They are indeed. We wanted to kind of give you guys a little bit of history on the idea of hauntings and poltergeists, though, before we kind of dive right into them, because that's just what we do here on Into the Portal. And it was kind of interesting looking into this because obviously when it comes to hauntings and ghosts and poltergeists and events like this and phenomena like this, it goes back presumably until the dawn of man, right? And this is a phenomena that could very well impact animals and other creatures as well. We're going to get into a little bit of that too. But without question, the concept of a spirit existing, right, after death has been extremely common, in humans since the earliest ancestors walked this earth. So it kind of begs the question, did Neanderthals and other early hominids, who perhaps met, for example, a violent death, did they end up haunting other Neanderthals or other Homo floresiensis or other whoever it might have been? I find that to be kind of an interesting thing.
Prehistory hauntings.
And then, like I just said, again, animals. I mean, imagine, for example, here running into a spectral great white shark, that met some sort of like terrible demise of some kind, right? Or perhaps maybe even a much older creature like a Ceratosaurus, which harkens back to our Monster of Partridge Creek episode.
Oh, totally.
Right, where there's this sort of idea behind it that we talked about.
An echo, perhaps?
Exactly, or some sort of an apparition or something that's clearly not an animal living there.
We brought up ghost kittens, too, at one point in this show.
Did we really?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
Oh, my God. I can't remember when it was, but it was pretty recently, I believe. And we talked about how, like, there was a story about the ghost kittens that the guy threw into the harbor.
Oh,
the sack of kittens, and then they came back to haunt them.
Yes,
and they were like mewing pitifully outside his window.
Right.
Anyways, ghost cats.
Indeed.
They exist.
And this ties into a few other things we've kind of talked about too. Like I even chucked in Mokele Mbembe here as well, because like with the Monster of Partridge Creek, Mokele Mbembe, very physical creatures and attacks, but also things that shouldn't be. That really shouldn't be there. Very much like a poltergeist in a lot of ways. But I digress, because we're looking at, to kick things off here, the history of poltergeist, dating as far back officially as the 1st century Common Era, the 1st century AD, if you will. But indeed, they go back much, much further. So basically, the details of the afterlife, obviously in different cultures, they vary all over wherever we're looking. But it does come down, for the most part, into the idea, some sort of conceptualization of the realm of the dead. Right? Typically governed by some sort of laws that typically can't be broken unless you're some sort of a special person or you have some sort of special object, whether it's the Book of the Dead, if we're talking ancient Egypt, or whatever it may be, right? But it's different everywhere you go.
Or the guide to for the recently deceased.
The handbook for the recently deceased. But poltergeists, no doubt, have existed in all of these ancient cultures in some form or another. They've been described in different ways. So we kind of wanted to just go through some of the more interesting ones. We pulled out a few. So like ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, Egypt, Rome, and things like that. So kicking things off with ancient Mesopotamians. This is some information I pulled from ancient.edu. And basically, the land of the dead was known by many names for the ancient Mesopotamians. Irkala, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the realm beneath the earth, the land of no return, if you will. This is where souls of the dead, they dwelt in essentially like desolate, dreary darkness, right? They fed off dirt, they sipped from mud puddles. And this is a kind of a parallel to like the Mayan sort of underworld. Like it's not a nice place. It's not ascending to heaven like in Christianity.
This reminds me of Beetlejuice again. It's like the sands of nowhere with death worms.
There was totally like Mongolian death worm reference in Beetlejuice. That was awesome.
That was great.
Loved it. But basically, the souls are permanently in this place of the afterlife, right? And this was also depicted in Gilgamesh. So this is in a slightly different way because there's different ideas of the afterlife in ancient Mesopotamia. And we've talked about Gilgamesh before. But basically, it goes with special dispensation, if you will. Okay, with special, like whoever had the power to give a soul to kind of cross back over, this is where ghosts could appear on Earth, right? Given license to exit the realm of the dead and come back to Earth. But it's not really the same way like we're shown poltergeists in like a modern way. You know what I mean? As if like to say like the poltergeist that's haunting a family in some whatever the cases we're going to get into today. We're like given license by some like gatekeeper god to like come back to Earth to kind of like finish what they were doing.
It begs the question whether there is a gatekeeper or if there is invitation by special energies manifesting within a human that's living.
Right.
We can discuss that too.
We can.
Potentially, but yeah.
This was a prevalent thing though. So like the living people of ancient Mesopotamia were fully aware of the presence of these entities being allowed to cross back over to finish unfinished business, essentially.
Okay.
And very much like poltergeists today, they were always associated with like violent death, improper burial, like whatever sort of like horrible ending it may have been.
Okay. I'm seeing it's almost like a hall pass to kind of go back and finish up whatever you didn't finish up.
Basically,
you know what I mean?
In a lot of ways.
Or get your vengeance.
That's the sort of freaky part about the idea of a poltergeist, right? Rather than it being a spirit tied to a place or whatever. Various different historians who have looked at ancient Mesopotamia, specifically, I pulled out this reference about doctors, because obviously most violent deaths way back in the day were from like the battlefield. I mean, a lot of people died in battle back in the day.
And honestly, that was considered an honorable death by all means.
It was, but violent though. True. At the same time.
And like you weren't expecting it to.
Exactly. And according to some historians, the doctors of ancient Mesopotamia, known as the Asu, and the Asipu? Probably butchered that. They allegedly employed spells in order to combat the rise of potential ghosts before they could actually like come back. So just trying to sort of like ward off these like potentially
creating
spirits.
creating gates or something for them or barriers.
Interesting, right?
I like it.
Ancient China. Let's move into that just a little bit here too, because poltergeists were definitely a thing there as well. The Chinese philosopher. How did I just say that? Philosopher. What a name. Mo Ti. That's an easy one to pronounce. 470 to 391 BCE. He argued in favor of essentially accepting the idea. He fully believed that ghosts were a real thing. He was constantly reporting on it, and he took in reports from this minister, Tu Po, who allegedly claimed to return from the afterlife after an assassination.
So we got Mo Ti and Tu Po.
Mo Ti and Tu Po.
I like
Damn,
it.
right?
I like it.
I mean, but the Chinese belief in ghosts was heavily influenced by like the idea of essentially like their practice of ancestor worship in ancient China, and the belief that the departed could still have influence on people's lives modern day, and it was a little bit less malevolent than in ancient Mesopotamia.
Take a look at Mulan.
Right.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Right?
They even have a festival. They
do.
Harkens back to Mulan. Very festive movie.
They have a festival. All of her ancestors are giving her guidance through that whole movie, right? They send her on that mission. They you know what I mean? It's hilarious. And then they send Mufu.
Mufu.
Right? That's the dragon's name.
I haven't seen it, and it's Eddie Murphy who plays the dragon, right?
Yeah. It's great. Love that movie.
Man.
I wish it was a Halloween movie. Mulan Halloween. No.
You want to watch it? It's been a while.
That's not.
There is an actual ghost festival. So it originated in honor of like appeasing the dead in China. And it continues to this day. It's held on the 15th of the 7th month of the year. And that's what just the quote I pulled up here from, what's this, ancient.edu.
So June.
Again. The ghost month, it's known as. And this is very similar to like Charmaine and some of these other things we've talked about in past episodes. This is a time where the veil between the living and the dead is thought to be the thinnest, where the dead can cross over, right? So very much like the Celtic one, the Day of the Dead in Mexico, you know, things like that. And people put out like food and gifts and stuff. So very similar to Charmaine, like we talked about last year.
Very similar. And you would think over in that side of the world, because that would be like almost like, that's June, right? The 15th day of the 7th month of June.
Right.
Or no, sorry, that would be May. May, not June. And that would be closer to their fall, wouldn't it? Like the end of their fall? Like kind of because they're on the other side of the world, obviously.
Never been there, but anyway.
I don't know, but I'm thinking that makes sense, right? Because New Zealand, their seasons are flipped.
That makes sense. So, I mean, it's like overall, it definitely sounds like a little less ominous than the previous.
But it's still a death, right? And it's a day of death, and it's a day of celebrating that transition. And a lot of the times fall, like natural seasons, are connected to that. So that would make sense more so, because it seems weird that, because like obviously the Day of the Dead is in the fall, right? It's in October.
Yeah. And
same with Samhain.
Indeed. I believe so anyway, right? Yeah, the first, like in fall or whatever.
I don't even know how to say that.
We got to come back. We got to rewatch our own.
And we
listen to our own episode.
It's almost like we watch them when we listen to them, though.
Very true.
Any podcast I listen to, I always imagine the hosts. Always. Or whatever they're describing.
Yeah.
Like Canadian Girl, she paints a vivid picture.
She does.
I love it.
I mean, people with aphantasia must not listen to podcasts.
They do, probably. But just in a completely different way.
Yeah, in a very different way. Anyway, we digress. Coming back to dead things, the veil. I think that's the most significant part about this sort of just very, very brief look at ancient China and ghosts. The idea of a veil, because that's kind of what we're dealing with poltergeist. This idea that like that's the big question I have for this episode is like what causes the crossover, what opens portals, and what makes a poltergeist different than other hauntings and experiences.
Is it a portal?
Other phenomena.
I guess so. It's an entrance. It is some sort of special circumstance connected to either a place or a person. And we're going to actually there are differing definitions for a ghost, a haunting, and a poltergeist.
Right.
There are variances and all of that too. I have the definitions further down in
we'll get into
episode.
it. We'll get into it.
Yep.
Ancient Egypt is another curious one, something that we've talked about in a few episodes, like with the underworld of Giza. And we talked about the idea of the Duat and other concepts with the Egyptian underworld, essentially, like referenced in a lot of things as a very real physical place, which is so fascinating to us and makes it a lot different than some of these other, like even looking at the sort of brief synopsis of the Chinese ghosts. It's a little bit more literal with the ancient Egyptians. But yeah, does this tie into the manifestation of poltergeist activity, like moving objects and things like that? Basically, like, okay, here's a quote. Here's a really interesting quote. This is from a professor of history and philosophy. He's a current journalist, and he writes for a few different websites. And I pull this again from ancient.edu. Joshua Mark. In the earlier period of Egypt, the soul was considered a single entity known as the Ku, the immortal aspect of an individual, but in later times, the soul was thought to be comprised of 5 different components. 2 of these components, the Ba and Ka, which we've talked about in the past, spirit and personality, came together after death in the form of the Aka. And it was this entity that would return as a ghost. If proper rites had not been observed in burial or some sin had been committed by the living earlier, before, or after the person's death, the Aka was given dispensation by the gods to return to earth to redress the wrong. Do you feel like that ties into the idea of a poltergeist? Because poltergeists usually start in a weird sort of playful way and end up malevolent in the experiences that we'll talk about today. Some
of them are explained, some of them aren't. And the cases we're actually going to get into specifically have never been fully explained, which is kind of interesting. But it's kind of, I immediately, as soon as you're like ancient Egypt, I'm like, boom, Pharaoh's curse, the mummy's tomb and the ghost and all that stuff. And it's been ripped off in so many ways in pop culture. But that's a really interesting little quote there.
I know.
I like that because it definitely ties into the philosophy of ancient Egypt too. It's not just the angered pharaoh that was disturbed after death in his tomb and la la la. And now he's wreaking his vengeance and la la la. Right. But I like that a lot, and I definitely think that is something that would tie into an earlier conception of what could be considered a poltergeist if there are recorded cases in ancient Egyptian culture that would describe things similar to what we're going to talk about today with our 2 case studies.
Yeah.
And of course, we need to look further into this. We always need to.
Prompts a follow-up episode
so
on just
many
pure ancient
wormholes.
ones. Pure ancient, like, poltergeist. Like, that's an episode in and of itself. Like, we should definitely do that. I mean, there's historic cases that are pretty special that
Patreon
we can cover.
exclusive,
Patreon
maybe?
exclusives. Ancient Rome was an interesting one. Just because, like, it was described that ghosts were allegedly, like, they appeared in very certain and predictable ways. At least that's what people believed, the ancient Romans. So it was always at night, which I find fascinating. I guess that's typical when it comes to like anything haunted or anything like that, but it does sometimes happen during the day. But they saw these apparitions as very real in both physical appearances at nighttime or in dreams. So whether it was a person's, a traumatic death or whatever it was, they would see entities in dreams and then sometimes the same ones in physical appearances. And it was always at nighttime. I thought that was kind of interesting. The 1st century AD, Pliny the Younger, okay, so one of the great Roman authors, he wrote down one of the first notable ghost stories, at least in Roman history, in his letters. And they became really famous for this super, super vivid account of life during the early heyday of the Roman Empire. But he reported that a specter of an old man with a long beard and rattling chains would constantly haunt him in his house in Athens, Greece.
It's like an earlier version of Marley and Marley.
Well, I wonder if that's where they got that from.
Interesting.
Like early shackles and stuff like that. Fast forward a little bit here, again, to the 1st century, a little bit further. So we've got this guy by the name of, this is a fun one. Let me see. Flavius Josephus Witnessed. No, I'm just kidding. It's Flavius Josephus. He basically saw an alleged exorcism, 94 AD. So according to a book called A Cross-Cultural Review of Psychokinesis, not Pyrokinesis, by Pamela Ray Heath, historian Flavius Josephus, he probably has the first claim for at least one of the earliest poltergeist activities like on record. So he reported this at the site of an exorcism in 94 AD, and he claimed that as the spirit was drawn out of the individual, after this was achieved, objects in the room were moved, most notably a large bowl of water that was across the room that got overturned in a violent manner. Now, this is kind of coming back to this whole thing again, like we'll talk about at the end, like demonic entity, the elemental, like human ghost, like possession in a person. Is this the same as like a poltergeist? The classic definition of a poltergeist. Yes, there's a bowl being chucked over that's physical activity that we do see with poltergeist activity. We don't need to get too deep into semantics here because it's all freaky shit no matter what happens.
What if it's Stranger Things? Ooh. Boom. Upside down. No, I was kidding.
But still, pretty freaky, especially for like 94, CE AD, right? Like if you hear this story, it's only going to like intensify the beliefs that were obviously very prevalent at the time.
Yeah. Oh,
Several hundred years later, this was kind of an interesting thing. 856 CE, the first official poltergeist, as we know it today in any case, was reported. Okay, so a ghost that causes physical disturbances such as loud noises or objects being thrown around. This was reported at a farmhouse in Germany.
Okay, and that's where we get the term poltergeist.
It's a German
translation for noisy ghost.
Right, and allegedly, in this case, the poltergeist tormented a family living there by throwing stones, starting fires, knocking things over, and just causing general mayhem around the house. And there are many reported poltergeists over the years. Say that 5 times fast.
Reported poltergeist.
That's tough. But really, none of them can be oh my God, I can't talk today. Adequately explained, including this one in Germany. It was a small town that these people lived in. I mean, bizarre. It's kind of one of those things. It's like you'd almost be afraid to tell people, like, especially if you were like, the church is either going to come after you or they're going to help you. It's one of those two things. You're either going to be like labeled witches or somebody might help you out.
Maybe. Or basically. They might just ignore you and you're just left for dead. Left to deal with it. Or make harmony with the ghosts like they did in Beetlejuice.
Well, that's enough of me mispronouncing things and rambling on. Let's get into a couple of our more modern, spooky Canadian cases.
Yeah, I was really stoked. I pulled a lot of both of them are from Barbara Smith's. It's the Canadian Hauntings. Oh, I don't have it in front of me right now, but it's an amazing book. It's going to be right in our show notes. Just so you guys know.
You've referenced it before, too.
I did reference it. That's where I got that other... I think it was the case of the haunted cats. I can't be 100% because I've been reading a lot of ghost books lately, but this one is particularly disturbing. And it originated on a military base in Edmonton, Alberta. So the story begins with the Millers, and their name has definitely been altered because they came out way later because they were in the military, right? You can't really be active and be, talking about this kind of stuff. It's kind of frowned upon.
No, for sure.
So, they're a military family, and they ended up moving to this base in northern Alberta. Date is unknown, unclarified in the book. And essentially, it was a family of 3. Don Miller, he was a military search and rescue technician, his wife, Bobby, and their infant son. When they moved to this base, they had no idea what was in store for them. And like I said, their story was kept under wraps for years later because of the distaste the military has for its personnel reporting paranormal experiences, especially on base.
Right.
Like this is on military property.
Yeah, not ideal. Really.
While continuing to remain an active employee. Like, no. That's definitely not something you can do. So very sensible. And I feel like that's a very common thread with Canadian paranormal encounters. We're all kind of afraid to share because we don't want to be laughed at. We don't want to be the butt of the joke. We don't want to be, the laughing stock, so
Definitely.
to speak.
No, for sure.
Yeah. But in this case, it started with the pets. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat.
It's all right.
It's not a frog. It's actually a dog and a cat in this case.
Started with a frog.
Started with a frog, man.
Cooked the legs. They were delicious. All right, let's move on.
The legless frog. The phantom frog.
Of the legless frog.
Creepy pasta.
Yeah.
Anyways. Okay, getting ahead of ourselves here. The Millers had a cat and dog, and both, as soon as they moved into this house, started to behave very strangely. They would both stare in this one specific corner of the living room, and the other target was the spare bedroom upstairs. The dog flat out refused to go into the spare bedroom, even when ordered. He was a very good dog, but
Never
he refused. He would whine incessantly. Even when anyone was in that room, he would just stand outside and watch them just to be sure. It was that weird.
Yeah, no.
Meanwhile, the cat would just stand in the doorway when no one was in there and just look in for hours at a time. Who knows what that cat was seeing?
You know what? I just, quick little rabbit hole side note here too. I saw a cool article posted in the our Strange Room on Facebook about cats and about how their sleep, like research into how they sleep and just like their perception at night, like would basically, they're poised perfectly to peer directly through the veil is what I gleaned from a very, very quick glance at this article.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I believe that.
Anyway, continue.
That makes cats kind of freakier.
They were already freaky.
It's almost, they're the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Except they can get out. Everybody else gets slaughtered in the house.
No one gets slaughtered in this story.
Indeed.
And the cat is definitely more intuitive, and the dog is too. They're both in the same boat. So there's this other weird thing. So I mentioned the living room corner. There was a dream catcher that they had placed in that corner, and both of the animals would stare at this. And meanwhile, the dream catcher, which was the first object in the house that began to move on its own, behaving very, very strangely, it would just spin. It would spin and spin, like incessantly, to the point where it was just furious, always in the same direction, and it would never get shorter, which is weird, right? You know, a string is spinning in one direction,
right?
No release. Eventually, it'd have to wind itself all the way up to the ceiling, but it never happened.
See, that almost makes me wonder if it was just a straight optical illusion. The fact that it's a dream catcher, too, is also just sort of a double weird thing because of obviously like the significance of a dream catcher and depending on who you are, what you believe.
Mm-hmm. I guess, yeah.
Creepy.
A dream catcher is like almost, maybe a portal. It catches things. So maybe it was kind of caught in the web for a while, but this didn't remain for very long. And like I said, this was... It was weird, but it wasn't malevolent. It was more like childish, like a kid trying to get attention.
Right.
And that's where it started. And then, of course, the TV was next.
Always.
Classic.
Always the TV.
Classic. It's a very old tube set that the Millers had. And it had that really old school channel knob. And you had to really like clunk it to change the channel. And it was like really stiff, really old and stiff. And Don, when he was at home one night watching a program, he watched as all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this knob turned slowly until it clunked to the next channel. This was something that began to be a pattern, and it got more and more annoying. At first, he was kind of just puzzled, but then it would just happen all the time to him, and always when he was alone. And he didn't actually tell his wife Bobby about it at first because he thought he was going to be like laughed at a little bit.
Okay.
But when she actually did confront her about it finally, she was like, oh, that happens all the time. All the time. Yeah.
What?
Yeah. And it was kind of funny because Dawn and Bobby both kind of kept their experiences private for a little bit. And it just ballooned from there. And it was like, again, right, classic attention-getting tactics where it just ramped up. It was incessant channel changing, constant spinning of the dream catcher. And one day, Don got so annoyed that he actually yelled at the Phantom to leave the TV alone. And it worked. It actually worked.
Right.
It stopped. And yeah, no, it was kind of funny because, like I said, like Bobby seemed a lot more like nonchalant about the whole thing. And Don was disturbed and annoyed. Like he was like, this isn't natural. I don't understand why we should just accept this kind of thing was the idea. But again, right, it wasn't anything that was going to be threatening to their lives or to their livelihood.
At this point, it didn't occur to be that way. Anyway.
No, it didn't seem to be that way. Back to the spare bedroom, because this was kind of a hot spot. So they had this spare bedroom, and it was for storage mostly because it was always surprisingly cold, even though it was in the upstairs in the second floor. And same room, pets never entered that room. They always just stared at it.
Bad news, man.
And so, of course, it became storage. You know, they kept all sorts of things in there, an old photo album, like many old photo albums of their family and whatever. And Bobby started to notice that there was 2 photographs in particular that began to appear regularly on the bed.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of strange.
And which ones were they?
That's just it. They're not clarified in the story. It's not as if they were portraits or anyone in specific, but they were always the same ones.
Right. And just to give you guys some context to that, like Amber especially, like we both did, but Amber especially for this particular case, like tried to dig in and find a little bit more. And short of like getting a hold of the actual author of the book where we pulled some of this information from, not a lot of info on this case, including the house itself, and like in terms of like who had lived in there before, how it was constructed and things like that. So it was really, really tough to find. It's one of those more obscure ones for sure, which makes it all the more fun in a way. We can speculate now.
Yeah. And so going back to the photos. Yeah, so Bobby, she was the first one because she was like, stay-at-home mom kind of thing with her baby. And she noticed that there was always these two photographs. And she kind of knew it was her husband. Always, the albums. And then she's just her husband. Like, same vision. And Don refused it was not him. It was not a writer that they had placed in the spare bedroom on top of a desk.
Right.
And this became the next focus of the poltergeist. And many a times the Millers would find it on the floor with no signs of a fall, no damage, no upheaval. It's not like it was on its side or anything, even though it was very heavy, very heavy.
Those old ones are hefty.
Yeah, antique. And eventually, the keys actually started typing at random when no one was even close to the spare bedroom. And then on several occasions, Bobby would be downstairs and she would hear the typing furiously upstairs. And then eventually she just got really tired of it and put the the typewriter in the basement. And she could still hear the sounds. Yeah. And then that's when she decided to place paper into the typewriter.
Smart.
Yeah. One day she had actually just got off the phone with her mother-in-law, who had just invited them over for dinner. And she was just, going about her business, doing the dishes or whatever. And she heard the keys typing away. So, ominous moment. She runs downstairs as soon as it's finished typing. She's very polite. She waits for it to finish. And then she's like expecting some profound message from the other side. And nope. She just gets this very mundane well wish from her phantom saying, "Have a pleasant time at your parents' home."
I mean,
not very spooky.
I mean, it is and it isn't, because obviously the idea of like something just constantly listening to you,
that is spooky,
not knowing who this was or what this is.
And why? Like, why are you there? Is it exactly that? Is it a benevolent spirit that's just trapped? Very similar to Beetlejuice, right? Where it's like just a couple that happened to die and they're just like, well, we're just here, I guess, forever. So,
just trying to have any kind of interaction at all. And I mean, maybe. If I was a spirit, I would probably be trying to do the same thing.
Yeah. There was actually sightings of a ghostly appearance of a woman. Dawn saw this on one occasion. He was standing at the top of the stairs and he glanced down the stairs and saw a slender young woman with shoulder-length hair and a dark floral dress at the bottom of the stairs. And then he turned away to beckon his wife over and she had disappeared by the time he got back. Yeah, so maybe it was her. Maybe she was an old typist from way back in the day or something and had some unfortunate occurrence. Anyways, you can conjecture all day about this kind of thing. We can conjecture all day,
but it does bring up a lot of interesting questions about poltergeist, because obviously like the dream catcher's spinning, there's other weird things that all fall in line with the idea of a poltergeist. But then we don't know what happened to this person. Was it a violent death? Was there a disinterred burial or whatever? It doesn't really appear to be that case.
I wonder,
here,
yeah.
Right? But like,
it wasn't violent.
But what is it attached to? Like, why the house? Is it the house, or is it just choosing to be there, or is it the people and this spirit was with them this entire time, or one of them? And now that they're in this house, it's finally like, well, we're settled in here now. I can start typing on a typewriter. Because some people believe that poltergeists are solely attached to people.
That's just it. That's where we're getting to this whole discrepancy between a haunting and a poltergeist, and we've kind of entertained that theme before. With the film Friday Poltergeist, and even a little bit with Beetlejuice too. And now it's very interesting though. And these people were very sympathetic. It's not like they were like, I don't know, like it wasn't as if they couldn't manage with it. And it just got to a point where they got a little freaked out. There was one instance where Bobby, she had just put her baby down for a nap and everything was, in order in the baby's room. She goes downstairs for a few hours until she hears the baby awaken, goes up to get it, And every single item of clothing that was in the baby's drawers is stacked neatly on top of the dresser. And as soon as that happened, she was like, okay, I'm not cool with this anymore because I have an infant and you know what I mean? Like that's priority number one and we need to get out of this place. And as soon as she told Don that, he was actually probably more happy than anything and was just like, yep, let's get rid of this place. And they just they moved out eventually very quickly. Actually, they just it's a military base. So you can just apply for a better house or a bigger house, right? Because they have a growing family and they kind of use that as an excuse. And they never looked back. They were like, nope, let's get out of here. And they never actually followed up on anyone that was living in there after them. So we're not actually sure if this activity continued or intensified.
Yeah, you have to wonder. I mean, obviously, if these things were sort of slowly ramping up for this family, if the next tenants were if it was going to pick right up where it left off. And I think that's kind of obviously there really is no rhyme or reason when it comes to poltergeist. Like there's some predictability in terms of at least you can put it into categories of what is what. But I mean, all this puts everything I believe and what I know and what I think I know and everything like that into total jeopardy and question when it comes to this type of thing. And when I was on the Zing This podcast last week, I don't want to put any spoilers or anything because they're launching it on Halloween, but everyone knows, I've said it many, many times, that when it comes to ghosts, this stuff freaks me out the most because you can't pin it down. You just don't know what's what. And even bringing in a priest to help you deal with something, it's okay, well, I feel slightly better, but then it also makes me question, it's should I be going to church every day? If this is working, then that might pose a problem for me.
Change your belief systems.
Indeed. We do have another really interesting case for you guys. Taking another hop, skip, and a jump over to more of central Canada here, Manitoba. So Manitoba Avenue, this really famous house on Manitoba Avenue. So a classic poltergeist case involving a young girl who spent most of her childhood essentially just terrified of various spectral apparitions haunting her home. And this tale picks up in and around 1953, Manitoba Avenue. This is Winnipeg, Manitoba. The Pipp family, they had just recently purchased a new home, and in the opinion of a lot of people in the neighborhood, it was kind of ugly. It was a bit of a monstrosity, if you will, and we know a lot of houses like that in our neighborhood too. It was made with a limestone foundation and had hideously ugly gray painted brick that gave the abode basically just very, very depressing, unpleasant feel. It was ripe for a haunting, essentially. But it was more than just the paint job, though, that would make this place the most frightening home for this family, which included a little girl named Eva and her mother and father. So it's just a little small family. She was only 3 years old when they first moved in to the Manitoba Avenue residence. When the little girl when she first entered, she climbed the ornate staircase, only 3 years old, while her parents explored the first floor. When they found their child, Eva was frozen solid. They had left her alone. She's climbing around, staring at a broom closet. That is way more ominous than the cats and dogs staring into a room. I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there right now.
Yep.
Okay. This place would become the center of activity in this house, the broom closet. What does that remind you of?
Poltergeist?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The toy closet.
Yeah.
But again, it's just this sort of room to nowhere, which is kind of funny. That's just sort of it reminds me of the Winchester too. It's closets are weird like that. If you're expecting it to not just have hangers for clothes and you open the door, it's a door to nowhere. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's just my observation of that. Eva, her mother and father, they often heard these phantom footsteps, especially near the front door on the staircase. And each stair creaking as if there was an invisible presence, making its way to the top. So always stopping at the closet door, though. And this is what terrified Eva. So that is just, so you've got these footsteps. I wish we had some sound effects here for this, so maybe we can add them in. And then it stops right at the closet door. Clearly some sort of a portal or something. Absolutely bizarre.
Yeah, freaky, man.
And every time this happened and Eva freaked out, her father would investigate. There was no intruders. There was nothing that could explain what was going on in the home. There was nothing there. There's no rats. There's no animals. There's nothing. And this poor little Eva, she suffered from being only 3 years old, she really suffered the most from these entities, if you will, this phantasmal presence in the home. And she would spend most of her daytime hours alone in the house as her parents worked, which is not really making it any easier for her, right? You're left at home to deal with all this crazy stuff.
Like, where's the nanny is my question.
Yeah. There had to have been somebody popping in and looking or whatever. Although this is kind of like, I don't even know. Maybe they were, I don't know.
They weren't poor.
Clearly not. I mean, because this is a nice house. I mean, it's ugly, but it's well built by all accounts.
Yeah, it was a big house.
Anyway, clearly being alone affected her, and she developed these habits to kind of protect herself. So she started sitting pressed up against a wall so that no ghosts could like sneak up on her from behind. This is their strategy in her head. She played the piano, and often while she played, she played to comfort herself, presumably. But often while she played, there would be an enormous crash heard at the bottom of the staircase with absolutely nothing to explain it. And you and I have experienced this as well, where we've heard the crashing of like a china cabinet with absolutely nothing to explain it.
Phantasmal sounds.
Absolutely bizarre. She also experienced this phantom, ghost, poltergeist, if you will, in the form of sounds exclusive to her parents, or to her bedroom quarters, rather. And she would often hear a ball bouncing against her wall and then followed by a scraping sound that would continue for like hours at a time.
It's like just taunting her.
Weird combinations of sounds, and clearly taunting. The scratching is the more ominous of those
It's so
two.
sad to think that a 3-year-old would have to develop a habit of being pressed up against a wall just because she's so just terrified of what is around her.
I feel like maybe she's
I wonder what she's doing today.
Yeah, no kidding, right? This is only 1953.
It's kind of like, I hope she's okay.
Craziness, right?
Yeah.
But things kind of got a little more visceral after that. I can be seen. I can touch you, if you know what I mean.
In a non-creepy molester way.
Well, some poltergeists definitely get into a little bit of a molesty kind of a vibe. I mean, the poltergeist stole a little girl through the closet and was using her energy to kind of like live vicariously in this other weird, creepy realm.
Alrighty. Well, that didn't happen in this case.
No, it did.
No, but Eva and her mother actually both saw an entity. It was described as a middle-aged man. He had brown hair and was often seen late at night. Eva would see him in her room. And her mother actually encountered him in broad daylight. In one instance, she actually was squeezed by this man on her arm. And she was convinced he was a living, breathing person because he was so real and so visceral that she followed him into the kitchen and he dissolved before her very eyes.
Dissolved. Love
very
that description.
Spooky. This wasn't the end of it, though. There were objects again. This is a very common theme in poltergeist intrusions. Objects that were like either they would randomly fall off shelves, counters. This would be pictures, decorations of some weight, things that a ghosty probably, you know what I mean? Like this is stuff that can't just be fallen because you step on a weird creaky floorboard and then all of a sudden it's like, you know what I mean? Like it wasn't even that old of a house, I don't think. So that kind of meh.
You can't chalk it up to that.
Not really. No. Other objects would randomly disappear, only to reappear much later in places they did not belong, and no one would ever admit to moving them. Again, very spooky. Yeah. There was actually, I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit here, because there was a sliver of bone that was deposited at the top of the staircase near the closet door. A random sliver of bone. These people didn't have a cat. They didn't have anything that would drag something in. And it just appeared in front of the ominous closet door.
I would want that analyzed.
They didn't touch it. They did not touch it.
Yeah, maybe a good call.
Yeah.
But that makes you wonder. It's like a bone of what?
I don't know. A human bone, perhaps. But it actually just disappeared later on. Just on its own. No one touched it.
Very, very strange.
It's almost like another hook. You know what I mean? Another sort of thing to tease you or to drag you to that place. And it was very spooky because after that happened, the Pips did investigate that closet a little bit further. They found that there was a space that was sealed off.
Oh, yes. I love this.
This definitely confirmed to the family that it was the epicenter of paranormal activity. However, According to Barbara Smith's account, they were too afraid to investigate it further. They would continue living through this hellish sort of endurance for 23 years before they sold the place.
23 years.
Of this weird phantasmal sounds and random spectral appearances. And obviously their only child, getting frightened to death on a nightly occurrence.
Man, that would be horrible. Just horrible.
And it was interesting because the new owners, they definitely experienced it like similar, if not a little bit different phenomena. There was this one account how they moved in and they actually found in the basement a layer of black water with no cause or explanation. Black. Pure black. How do you explain that?
Once again,
there was no rain. There was no nothing, no flooding, no anything. And it was kind of funny. They supposed it was the spirit announcing his presence before the new owners.
Man, what a way to make an entrance.
Yeah.
I mean, these things that you just described, this might sound like a little bit out of left field, but like the idea of like, these are very physical things, right? Like water, black water, doesn't make any sense. Why is it black? Why is it there?
How did they get rid of it? Did they pump it out? I wonder.
These sorts of things are even the idea of like things being physically moved and they end up where they're not supposed to be. It reminds me of Skinwalker Ranch. Where I'm thinking of like, you know, the wolf in the earlier paranormal activity with the fur that's like deceased flesh that's like left over behind. Doesn't make any sense. Very similar to the water. Is that like rancid water of like
dead people?
What is that? And then obviously things being moved. Like there was like whatever the post digger at the top of a tree, and very similarly with like poltergeist activity. I might be sort of just very unintentionally crossing over into some sort of grand unified theory here, which I'm not planning on doing in this episode. So I'm going to just stop talking and we can continue on here.
Well, there's a lot of theories and ideas surrounding this type of activity. We're not going to do a full comprehensive survey of all of them. There was a few ideas that we thought were kind of interesting. There was one that was from this institute in Italy.
Yes.
Istituto Fisica Superiore in Cagliari.
Yes.
Cagliari, sorry. Cagliari. And they were researching what might cause or attract a poltergeist, trying to explain the origins of this phenomena and these objects and all this stuff. So, of course, they kind of, you know, doing a quick whatever, look around the world, these encounters or phenomena tend to have one thing in common that they kind of pulled out, and they often occur in the neighborhood of a young child or kind of a pubescent woman, like, you know what I mean?
Young women, like a young child or a young woman.
Young women, basically. Young children.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Even though in the case of the military base, it was actually a young boy.
Right.
But who knows what the actual, anyways. The idea is that, according to them, the changes of the brain that occur at that puberty level, they involve in fluctuations of electron activity that in rare cases can create disturbances up to a few meters around the brain, which could ultimately result in physical disturbances of objects around someone.
It's basically saying like unintentional, like psychokinetic ability.
It's Carrie all over again.
It is. It's basically saying like this is like,
telekinetic.
Yeah, or telekinetic rather. Yeah. So like, like that there's like basically a field meters out around the brain at this time. But that's kind of a stretch for me when we hear stories and cases of things being really like picked up and swirled around a room. I mean, a spinning dream catcher, maybe. Like, right? Like it's already hanging, like there's already gravity being like, you know what I mean? It's already being helped out a little bit. It's hanging from a string. It's not like a couch being moved across a room, or even like a bowl of water being flipped over for that matter.
I'm thinking even like with the Hexam heads, and there was children in that household, and there was an object as well. And it's like, what was the actual energy centered around, I wonder?
Whether it's female or male, kids are always susceptible to all of these creepy cases we come up with. And this is where we're sort of straddling that line between like deceased human spirit as a poltergeist, or it doesn't matter if it's a young woman or a young boy. In the case of the Millers, it was a young boy. But if there's an entity, it doesn't have to be demonic. It doesn't have to always be this malevolent, like whatever, like rah-rah, like supporters of payment or whatever. But like not of this earth. You know what I mean?
Well, getting back to this article here, it's kind of interesting because they kind of, they're a little reductionist, maybe. They kind of, they go to quantum mechanics and these fluctuations that occur. This is kind of weird. Okay, so it says here, children generate poltergeist activity by channeling energy into the quantum mechanical vacuum. These disturbances would be similar in character to the quantum mechanical fluctuations that physicists believe occur in a vacuum, in which virtual particle and antiparticle pairs pop up for a fleeting moment before they annihilate each other and disappear again. These scientists believe that the extra fluctuations are triggered by the pubescent brain would substantially enhance the presence of virtual particles surrounding the person. This could slowly increase the pressure of air around them, moving objects, even sending them hurtling across the room. This is their idea.
Right. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I think I love it because it's just like a very conventional way of trying to explain something that we have no explanation for.
And the thing is that this doesn't always occur when there's kids. Like it's common, but that can't explain.
Or perhaps just like weird energy, you know, traumatic energy maybe too. You never know.
Well, I mean, you're bringing up this idea of obviously the physics of the spirit in a sense too. I mean, they're not talking about spirit. They're talking about basically like poltergeist being explained in another sort of manner of like physics, basically quantum physics. But I'm very curious about that because if we're believing that these are actual entities, the physics of a spirit is really fascinating to me. Like an entity being able to touch a person, break bones, pull hair, scratch skin, move objects. What state did they have to be in? Or what state, like how are they capable of affecting matter in this realm, right? Like stuff that is governed by the laws of gravity, things like that. That is like, man, it's like if there's anything the military should be researching, it's ghosts. I feel like there's like the powers of that are like
ghost
much
soldiers.
Greater. Ghosts, well, yeah, just like in Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah,
badass. But yeah, I find that to be just such a confusing thing. It's like they're creating their own anti-gravity fields based on their own state of matter, which is not of this world. It's a state of matter that can't be explained in our realm, basically. And therefore, they're able to impact objects.
They're above us and beyond us.
I mean, yeah, and you threw out the idea of like the Hexham heads too. Like cursed objects is another sort of strange thing that sort of ties into this too. It's like, could a poltergeist potentially be, I mean, sort of channeling itself through an object in a case like the Hexham
Many
heads?
people would argue that, even in the case of like haunted dolls, right? That's very much the same case.
Well, we have the doll in Poltergeist that ruined my childhood, where it's acting through a clown.
Yeah.
They definitely jazzed up that clown for the remake.
Oh, what was that one that we covered in, was it called Ed? What was the name? It's a very simple doll. And he lives in a museum now. Robert the doll.
Yeah.
Or the original Annabelle, I guess, eh?
Yeah.
But that's, cursed objects. There was also another interesting Canadian case of a woman, a nurse, who happened to find an old-fashioned nurse's cap. She was working at a psychiatric ward, I believe, and she ended up taking the cap home. The next day, she brought the cap back, and she was just mortified, just absolutely terrified of this thing. She put it back exactly where she found it, and then a few hours later, it was just gone.
Very strange.
That's like almost an invitation, right? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And same with the sliver of bone, you could suppose, hey, with the Pips family, and
like what would have happened if they took that bone? Or if they moved
it's the bait.
It? Yeah. It's so ominous. That reminds me of like Insidious, like and stuff like that. Whoa. And of course it does. Like we mentioned in the middle of the show, like we experienced something like this when we were living in one of our, not our most recent place, but the place before, where we were just chilling downstairs and there's this massive crash, like the most loud, violent smashing of plates we'd ever heard. And both of us looked at each other and we sprinted upstairs to make sure our landlord was still alive, that she didn't get crushed by a china cabinet. And she was just sitting there reading. She was like, "What noise?" That was so bizarre.
No
but of course,
explanation.
it's a house that nobody had died in.
Yeah.
They had built it themselves. It clearly had not been built on top of a cemetery like in the movie Poltergeist.
You never know. It's overlooking a bluff.
I suppose it's possible. It could have been some sort of very old cemetery.
Yep.
But that's just all these things that come into question when it comes to the poltergeists and these types of entities. And you still haven't really given me a straight answer when I keep throwing this out, because it's super weird. A ghost or a spirit from a former earthbound living creature is different from an entity from another realm, right? Demons, elementals, things like that, like the elemental at Lep Castle. But all of these things can occupy living people, objects, they can haunt, they can come forth as poltergeists. Does that not strike you as extremely strange and convoluted?
It's all very convoluted, and that's why I wanted to bring up a few different definitions, right, for just the differences or interpretations and all this stuff, where ghosts in particular, you know, if you're talking about ghost, you're talking about a spirit of someone that was at one point living, and they're kind of caught in this sort of ambiguous plane of existence between this and the next. And they're most likely intelligent. They can interact with the living in various ways, whether it's through spoken or through a pinch on the arm or through just an apparition, you know what I mean? Versus a haunting, which would be a recording of an event on an environment. They don't interact with the living. It's very much like those haunted Roman soldiers that kind of like march through that house.
I see.
You know what I mean? Where they're just doing their thing. It's not like you can be like, hey man, what are you doing here? And they'll like look at you and be like, what? Why are we here? Oh my God.
Exactly.
We got to get going, boys. But, and then poltergeists, right? Which are neither ghosts nor hauntings, caused by the unconscious mind of a living person, energy manifesting, usually under some kind of stress.
That's just one definition, though.
It is just one loose definition.
Because we gave the first one at the beginning, where it's clearly not that.
No, I know, but like this is almost like what we gave was almost like the causation of what is the actual source, right? Okay, let me ask you this then. If we're ready to get to this, do you buy that? Are you buying into that? Do you believe that that is the source? Yeah, I think definitely if you're talking about poltergeist, you're talking about an aggravation that is in conjunction with a living being. It's neither haunting nor ghost, right? And so I'm not even sure, like when we're talking about like the two cases that we laid out, do you think in your mind that those are both poltergeists, or do you think that they were attached to the place? Because with the Millers, it seemed very much attached to the place. They moved in there, all this stuff happened to them, they left and never found out if it continued. Versus the other case, the Pips, seem to be attached to the place too. So it's almost as if you're going to take these definitions as literal, it almost seems as if they're more ghosts than poltergeists. But it's almost like an amalgamation, and that's where you're kind of you kind of
right, because
like alluded to that too, right? Where it's like I feel as though there could be combinations, not black and white.
No, it isn't, because like, okay, the way you've delineated this now, it's like ghosts, that would be specifically the spirit of a deceased individual, or entities, if you will, that can't be ascribed, that can cause poltergeist-like activity.
Exactly.
And
that's almost
the
like
confusion here.
It's almost like a Beetlejuice, right? Where he is kind of like he is a ghost, but he wants to be a poltergeist. Like he needs to attach himself to something living, right, in order to actually cause that chaos.
Totally. And then I guess this is the other side of it too. If beyond that, like beyond like misinterpreting like a haunting to have as being like poltergeist activity, if it's the stress, it's the energy, it's this manifestation created by an individual, can that open gateways? Can that open portals? Can that impact things that we can't see and understand? So it's not necessarily like the energy is picking up a broom and throwing it across the room, and there's absolutely nothing more paranormal beyond it. It's just pure quantum physics. But that this energy that is this definition of a poltergeist creates a gateway.
That's exactly,
and that's what they were trying to play on in that movie. In the 80s movie Poltergeist,
we should
even
watch,
though it was just a mashup.
We need to go
everything.
watch the 82 or 86, the Poltergeist 2.
We do. Definitely.
Let's do it.
Definitely.
It's Halloween.
But I mean, like maybe
Almost.
I think that's what they were going for in that movie, right? It's like the little girl is opening the gateway.
Very true.
Rather than that she's the sole cause.
Yeah, and the original, the like kind of epicenter of all of it was a house, but now it's gone. But then obviously there's going to be two other movies, so it has to be centered around this girl.
Right. And then the curious thing, of course, with that was like once the gateway's open, it's like, okay, the door's open and there's a whole bunch of different things on the other side of that door.
And there's they called the beast, or what was it called again in that one?
It was non-human, and that's the thing I'm questioning here. It's like, because if things are coming over or crossing through and causing activity, it's so hard to ascribe anything, right? Oh man, that's an episode in and of itself too, like purgatory, the in-between, the whatever. There was real spirits that they talked about, like in that movie, and then there was the elemental. I love using that word. That's what it is. It's this strange, like unimaginable entity that was doing whatever. It wasn't like Joe who died in a tractor accident 3 years ago down the road.
No, but it's almost like an amalgamation of all of that, right? Because it essentially is a manifestation of a lot of negative energy, hatred, all this stuff, pain, suffering. And that was what Lep Castle was. So makes sense.
Right.
Makes sense. That's kind of interesting, though, because it is not an individual. It's an amalgamation. It's a whole collective of craziness.
Whole collection of craziness.
I really liked this episode. Sorry, I just wanted to put that out there.
I did too. No, I've had a lot of fun.
It was kind of, I didn't even know where this was going to go because I just kind of picked up this Barbara Smith book and I was like, dang, like this is awesome. Canada, creepy Canada.
Yeah.
I love it. Did you have any I don't know, conclusions?
I guess just my final thought would be that I have no idea what to make of any of this and that I'm so confused by the idea of a poltergeist, even though I feel like we've kind of narrowed it down and I have an idea of what we're dealing with when we read these cases. But then when you watch Hollywood movies and we read other articles and there's different aspects of stories where I thought I was reading a poltergeist story. I thought I was looking at a haunting, and then it's like A, B, and C that are So that's what I love about this, because it is the most bizarre of anything in the paranormal, in my opinion. It's different than chasing cryptid creatures. It's different than trying to spot UFOs and analyze UFOlogy. This is the most obscure. And there's so many cases, there's a laundry list. The Bell Witch in the 1800s has been designated as a poltergeist case. The Black Monk of Pontefract in the 1960s has been designated as a poltergeist case.
Can't forget the Einfeld case, too.
Exactly. What was that, just very briefly?
Well, it was that England case. There was the two sisters. Classic, even though a lot of people have seemingly debunked it. And, it's one of those ones where it's just all for debate kind of thing. But another case, right, where it's just seemingly unconvincing evidence, young girls involved, potential hoax, who knows, and that's it. If you haven't experienced firsthand, then it's really hard to make an actual judgment on it. And that's kind of why we are I feel like we are grasping at straws. Well, we can read the cases, we can look into the history, and in the end, it's like once you experience something like this firsthand, you just don't really know.
Yeah. And
that's kind of my concluding thought.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. And honestly, we just want to know if you guys have ever experienced anything like any of this. We want to know. I mean, we want to know what you guys think of this episode, but definitely hit us up, because we know a bunch of you out there who have posted in the Strange Room or into the portal, on our podcast forum there, that you've had some experiences kind of like the families that we've talked about in this episode.
Yeah, and we want to do a Patreon bonus episode talking about hauntings in prolific places.
Yes.
We have a couple of castles that we want to talk about. So that's going to be really cool. It's coming down the pipe real quick. So
definitely,
if you haven't already, go check out our Patreon.
Yeah.
I just there's a lot of cool stuff. And now we've got a few new members and it's really fun. And we just want to keep it going strong and we just appreciate you all so much.
We really do. And honestly, even at our $1 level, we send you guys all kinds of cool stuff. And it really helps keep the show going. We've been able to upgrade our equipment because of Patreon. And you guys really do keep the lights on. It's not just a cliche.
It really is. Yeah.
So we really, really appreciate that. And even just for hopping on to check it out, thank you guys for doing that. Shoot us an email. If you don't want to post on social media, intotheportalmailbox@gmail.com. Follow us on socials, though, if you do, at Into the Portal Podcast on Instagram, at Into the Portal 1 on Twitter, at Into the Portal Podcast on Facebook, and always remember to smash that subscribe button. Tell your friends about the show. Spread the love of Into the Portal. Pumpkin carving. Keep that in mind. I'm just throwing that out there one last time at the end of the episode because I'm so stoked to see what you guys got going.
Yay.
But until next time, on Into the Portal.
Your gateway to the bizarre. This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.